On behalf of the Little Compton Historical Society, welcome. My name is Jenna Magnuski. I am the educator for the Wilbur House. This is the first of our winter and spring slate of programs, which is supported by the Acebe's Family Fund. As I had said before, please visit littlecompton.org to learn about the other programs that we have planned and to register for those. Before I introduce our speaker, I want to remind you that you can send any questions that you have as they come up. To do that, you'll need to open the chat window. If you are on a desktop computer, that's generally in the bank of buttons, the controls at the bottom of your screen, and the chat button is toward the center. If you are on a mobile device, you'll have to tap the screen and then click on More in order to access the chat option. So we are joined tonight by Dr. Charlotte Carrington-Farmer, Associate Professor of History at Roger Williams University. And this is actually the second time that Charlotte is joining us. She previously spoke about Roger Williams' wife, Mary Barnard, at our annual meeting this August. A little bit of background on her. She earned her PhD at the University of Cambridge Trinity Hall. Since arriving at Roger Williams, she has consistently won awards for her teaching. She teaches and studies on a variety of topics in early America, including pirates, slavery, and indigenous histories. And this semester, she is teaching an entire course on witchcraft in the Atlantic world, so we knew we had to get a snippet of that for all of you. So without further ado, Dr. Charlotte Carrington-Farmer's Beyond Salem 1692, Witchcraft in the 17th Century.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction, Jenna, and for having me back again so soon. Just looking at the names popping up, it's really nice, as you said, to see some familiar faces and names and some new folks too. So I'm really happy to be here with you this evening. So I'm just going to go ahead and start screen sharing. Give me 1 second. All right then. Okay, I'm just going to move this. I'm going to move this. All right, very good. All right, so as Jenna said then, this talk came about because one of the great privileges of my job is that I get to teach some really fun classes at Roger Williams University. And the one Jenna mentioned that this talk is based on is Witchcraft in the Atlantic World. And in that class, and I know looking at the names, there's a couple of students who have either taken that class before or have been in it recently with me. They'll know then that that class looks at witchcraft in early modern Europe, witchcraft in the Americas, both by looking at colonial and indigenous beliefs, and then also considers simultaneously African witchcraft. So building on that then, I want to give you a taste of some of the things that I get to cover in that class. So as the title suggests, I'm going to be talking about broad ideas about witchcraft in the 17th century. We're going to have a look at some of the ideas about witchcraft in mainland Europe in the 17th century. Then we're going to turn our attention to England in the 17th century, and then finally come and look at Salem in 1692 in comparison to with what's going on in other parts of the world. And I also really want to try as hard as I can to share with you this evening as many primary sources as I can. And it's really, I think I have to be honest with you, some of the primary sources are quite sexual in nature and are quite graphic in places. So I just want to say as it goes on, like that's the nature of what people believed about witchcraft in the 17th century. So I just want to give you a heads up if you have any young children listening later on. And then I want to close then by trying to set Salem in 1692 in context. And then I've got some further reading to suggest if anyone is interested. So let's start with the stereotypes then. So I feel like when I start my class with my students, I ask them to kind of imagine what they think of when a witch comes to mind. And I think this is what most people have, right? Like I just pulled these images off of Google, but we tend to think of a witch here as being kind of, they're quite often green, they have a long pointy nose, perhaps with a wart on, they've definitely got a chin, they've got teeth missing, they've got kind of haggard looking faces and hair, they've got long spindly hands, they often have pointy toes, you know, they wear drab clothes, they tend to have some type of hat on, on. And a witch might be found making a spell, perhaps over a potion like this. And a witch often in our imagination has an animal with her. And I think most of the time we would think of a witch having a black cat. And then on the bottom left, you see the other thing that I think we tend to think of with witches is that she flies. And so what we're going to try and do in the next, I'm going to try and talk to you for about 45, maybe 50 minutes, is try to unpick some of these stereotypes to see like how true were they when people truly believed in witchcraft in the 17th century. So I want to talk to you a little bit tonight about what kinds of people were accused of witchcraft. What did that mean? What practices did witches engage in? You know, where and how did witches attain their supernatural power? Like, how did you become a witch? And then building on that, how were witches detected? And then what were some of the steps that communities tried to do to get rid of witches once they had identified them? So let's start then with the power of witchcraft. So in the 17th century, the witch was a human being who was believed to have superhuman powers, i.e. that meant that and I'm going to use, when I'm talking about witches generally, I'm going to use she, like female pronouns, and I'll unpick the gender element a little bit later on. But for now, I'm going to go with she. She had the ability to harm others by using supernatural means. Although a witch's power could harm anyone, in the 17th century, it was widely known that victims tended to be close neighbors or other people who knew her well enough to anger her. So it was often based on personal disputes. And I want you to keep that in mind as we think about conflict between neighbors later on this evening. A witch then could specialize in certain kinds of harm. Perhaps she specialized in causing illness or death, particularly harming spouses or young children. Perhaps a witch specialized in doing minor injuries or accidents, such as causing temporary blindness, memory loss, or clumsiness. The power of the witchcraft then, the object of a witch's malice could be both human but also animals too. So a witch could choose to target animals as well. So there are so many accounts from the early modern Atlantic world of witches targeting horses, cows, and causing them to die and to wander off by bewitching them. And quite often we see unusual behavior in animals basically is sometimes seen as the trigger for a witchcraft accusation. So the first point you see on the screen is a direct quote from one of the sources that, you know, one man's cow was taken with strange fits, jumping up and knocking her head against the fence, and it was believed that she'd been bewitched. And then witches could also cause other types of harm, so such as a middle point you see on the screen, such as causing storms at sea, damage to crops, stopping cows from giving milk, beer to spoil. All these could be seen as signs of harmful magic. Other common accusations that went hand in hand with witchcraft were witches were accused of obstructing reproduction, perhaps preventing conceptions, causing women to miscarry, causing childbirth fatalities, etc. So these were kind of the common things that witches were accused of in the 17th century. And here's a really good example. I say I'm talking about the 17th century, but fair heads up, this source is from the 16th century. It's from 1544, but it gives you the sense then that this is from mid 16th century in Germany, and we can see then that the witch, you know, really traditional early modern witch here, who's caused harm to this stable hand who's got his curry comb in his hand. He's been brushing the horse and he's just passed out completely in the middle of it, and this horse looks pretty angry too. I wonder if she's bewitched the horse too. So this is the type of harm then of what a witch was believed to do in the 17th century. So before we get any further then, I want to talk to you and make it really clear that different people in the 17th century had different concerns when they thought that someone was a witch. So for most people then, for the laity and the general population in the 17th century, for most of those people, the harm that they feared, their critical concern was the harm that witches could inflict on them themselves, right? Like, is a witch going to bewitch me and kill my child or spoil my crops or damage my property? And for most people, witches were seen as being criminals who simply worked in a supernatural way. And this was the traditional concern perception of most people in England and New England in this period. The second point that you see on the screen then is that for the educated elite, particularly for the clergy, they weren't so much concerned about the harm that witches could inflict on them and their property. They were absolutely obsessed and couldn't think of anything else apart from the relationship between the witch and the devil. So there's a dual concern here. Most people are concerned with the harm that witches can cause them and their family, but for the clergy, the witch was a big threat because of the relationship that she had with the devil. And it was believed widely in the 17th century that witches agreed and signed a covenant, often in blood, with the devil. And so to the clergy then, and many of the educated elite, witches were not only enemies of society, but principally they were also enemies of God. And the devil was basically recruiting people to help destroy organized religion. So it's really important that we keep these two concerns in our mind as we work our way through the primary sources today. So how was witchcraft performed then? So it was, again, widely believed in the 17th century that a witch could perform her magic, an affliction could come through simply by looking at someone. So again, keep this in mind. If you've had a dispute with your neighbor and you give them a bit of a funny look, I know some of my neighbors are on this Zoom call. I've not given you any funny looks. You give someone a funny look and lo and behold, something bad happens the next day. That could often lead to a witchcraft accusation. So witchcraft could be through a look or a touch. The other thing is a curse. So a witch's grumbling words or, thinly veiled threats following an argument with a neighbor or a family member were often taken as evidence that the witch was planning on or initiating harm. So you had to kind of be really careful, I guess, about how you behaved in the 17th century. As I said then, animals really were also the agents of harmful magic, and of which was believed in the 17th century to have animal familiars or imps who basically could go out and cause harm on the witch's behalf. So there is some truth, I guess, to the idea that it makes sense in our mind's eye now that a witch would have a black cat following around, because in the 17th century, it was widely believed that witches had animal familiars that would go and do harm for them. Not always a black cat, and I'm going to show you some examples, but a whole range of animal familiars were widely associated with witches. And it was believed that these animal familiars or imps would have to come back and nourish themselves on the witch's body. And these animals could basically perform acts of evil on the witch's behalf, and they themselves were supernatural beings. So how else was witchcraft performed then? Well, let's talk a little bit more about these animal familiars then. So animal familiars assumed various forms and disguises while they were doing their activities. And I've included a quote on the screen, the first one. So it's not always a black cat, right? That's the one that's just endured in our mind's eye. But animal familiars were seen to be as a white thing like a cat, something like a little dog. And it was believed then that they needed to feed once a day. And so one of the things that happened is that witches' bodies were searched basically for that teat that it was believed that the animal would return back to suckle on and to nourish. A witch then, this is a middle point on the screen, you see, a witch could also turn him or herself into an animal. So there's, in some parts of Europe, there's this belief that a witch could transform her being into something else, often into an animal, to go and carry out harmful deeds. Witches could also recruit real animals to do their bidding too, or a witch was believed in certain parts of Europe to be able to turn people into animals. So animals frequently feature in witchcraft accusations in a plethora of ways. The final point you see on the screen then, poppets and rag dolls. So it was again quite widely believed then that witches use poppets or rag dolls to cause injuries. So a witch could basically cause harm by like stroking or prickling or tormenting basically an image of the victim. And witches' houses were often searched for these. There was also a belief in counter magic that if you put a poppet doll in the walls of your house, it could then ward off the witch's magic. So if the witch was trying to harm you with a poppet, if you had a doll in the walls of your house, that doll might feel the pain instead of you. So a little bit more of animal familiars then. The image you see on the screen then comes from England in the 17th century. This is Matthew Hopkins. He was a witch hunter in the 17th century, in the first half of the 17th century, and his career flourished during the English Civil War. He was known as the witch finder general, and he basically headed up a bunch of witch hunts, primarily in East Anglia. So this image, I absolutely love it, right? So we can see the witch finder here dressed in all of his 17th century glory. And we see here a couple of witches basically naming their imps, naming their animal familiars. And you can see then that some of these animals are pretty identifiable, right, as kind of like a rabbit or a dog or kind of like a cat, but some of them are not animals that are that are actually real animals. So the point I want to make to you is that animal familiars didn't have to be like an exact animal that people had seen. They could take on these kind of fanciful forms with long swirling tails and horns. So again, if you're interested in animal familiars, I'm more than happy to talk more about them later on. Okay. Sorry, just there we go. All right then. So how was witchcraft performed? So witches were believed to have the capacity to injure people in supernatural ways, and this was the most common power that was attributed to witches. Witches were believed to be able to perform feats that were beyond what was considered humanly possible. So perhaps like hold their breath for a really long time, to be able to levitate or speak a different language, or like be really strong and lift people up when that wasn't humanly possible. Witches were also believed to be able to tell fortunes and predict what should come to pass. Witches also had the ability to summon even evil spirits, and also there's a belief in some parts of the world of necromancy, where a witch can connect to the dead. Witches could also render themselves invisible, so they could just make themselves invisible as and when necessary. But I think the most common thing that again is endured in the popular imagination is the bottom thing that you see on the screen, which is witches were believed to be able to fly through the air with or without the aid of a stick or a pole. So we do see that belief that we think of as witches flying on a broom, it has its roots really clearly in the 17th century. So we can see here then some of our stereotypes playing true, right? So we see a witch here. I mean, this is really similar to that kind of cartoon image I showed you. This is a woodcut from the 17th century, appeared in Mather's Wonders of the Invisible World, published in 1689. And then it was used again in the 18th century in a pamphlet about witches in England. But this woodcut is a really amazing primary source, right? We see the kind of old woman with the pointy nose, the kind of haggard looking face, both this lady and this lady who's about to be recruited, the really pointy chin, like the kind of pointy hands too, pointy feet, just as we saw. And we can see that she's riding on a broom, and she's accompanied by the devil, who is a black man with horns, with wings as well, and kind of you can see his pointy hands and his taloned feet. And what's really interesting about this is that we have a male witch following behind. Flying in the 17th century was gendered, so female witches were believed to fly on brooms, whereas male witches would typically fly, if they used an object, on a pitchfork, because a broom was a domestic a piece of equipment that would be a woman's work to sweep, and then the pitchfork is the man's work in the 17th century out on the field. So the flying apparatus reflected that too. So one of the main things that we need to know about witchcraft in the 17th century is that concern that really dominates all of the stuff that the clergy writes about, and that is that pact with the devil. So when we look at primary sources, in particular trial testimonies, they frequently include evidence that a pact had been made with the devil. And how you basically, like, how do you become a witch? The one thing that you have to do to be a witch is that you need to sign your name in the devil's book. This is a moment where you basically go from being bewitched. If a witch or one of her animals is torturing you and possessing you, you're not actually a witch yourself until you sign your name in the devil's book. And that's going to be really important when we look at the case from Salem, when we look at Tituba, when she confesses to signing her name in the devil's book, and when she basically throws everybody else under the bus by saying, I saw all these other people who'd signed their names in the devil's book. So that's a moment when you became a witch, when you signed your name in the devil's book. So witches then were also used as the devil's instrument, as we just saw on the woodcut just a second ago. Witches were used to entice and to recruit others. And the devil would do this in a bunch of different ways, right? Like he typically would target vulnerable women, right, like by offering them promises of things that they couldn't have in real life. So perhaps wealth or a husband or a child. So this is where we see this kind of stereotypical witch in the 17th century of being an old unmarried woman kind of come from. But again, I'll talk a bit more about how that's not necessarily true, certainly in certain places in the large scale hunts. So the devil then would start off by trying to get people to be a witch by offering them things, right? By saying, I'll give you wealth, I'll give you a husband. But if that doesn't work, the devil also used torture to make people become a witch. So again, keep that in mind when we come to Tituba later on this evening. So witches then who had been possessed and were about to sign the devil's book repeatedly said that they felt choked and they felt 1,000 cruel pinches all over their body. And people who were being afflicted but hadn't signed the devil's book, you know, were often visited with really strange fits, and sometimes they were weeping, sometimes they were laughing. And those who were caught in this peculiar kind of in-between stage of being bewitched but not actually being a witch were called possessed. And if you signed your name in the devil's book, that's when you take on the status of being a witch. So as I said then, the stereotypical witch in the early modern period is seen as being a woman who's old, who's unmarried, perhaps has never married or is perhaps widowed, and lives on the margins of society. There is some truth of that, but historians have done a lot of work recently to kind of debunk some of these myths, and especially in some of the large-scale hunts that we see in Germany, and also we see in Salem too. You know, rich, wealthy men are accused. So in those later stages of the large witch hunts, nobody is safe. And a really good example from Salem is Philip English, you know, one of the richest man in Salem, I think, who is a wealthy merchant, gets accused of witchcraft, you know, as does a former minister. So it's not always a stereotypical woman who is accused of being a witch. So how do you identify a witch in the 17th century, right? Someone's made an accusation, like how do you prove that to be true? Well, one of the things that you would do is that you would search for the devil's mark and the witch's teat. So you're literally physically searching her body. The devil's mark then is basically a mark that is placed on the witch's body by the devil when she signs the covenant, when she signs the agreement and puts her name in the book. And, you know, this almost reminds me of like Harry Potter with the dark mark when Voldemort gives that to his followers, right? Like I think that J.K. Rowling perhaps got the inspiration from this, right? So you get a mark from the devil. In addition, then they're also searching for a second mark, which is the teat, where her animal familiar was believed to suckle on her body to feed. And this could be located anywhere on her body, but it was quite often found on a woman's breast or around her vagina. So juries of women then were basically charged by local authorities to search the bodies of women who had been accused. And just, I mean, they were literally looking for any mark or abnormality on your skin. And I can imagine it was really quite easy to find like a mole or a lump and to use that as evidence. The final point you see on the screen then, the kind of the gold standard of proving someone was a witch was you were looking for someone to self-confess, right? This was the surest sign of guilt. And it leads in certain parts of early modern Europe and also occasionally in New England to really extreme methods to extract a confession of guilt. You know, the example that we see from Salem is Giles Corey, who ends up being pressed to death because he wouldn't enter a plea of guilty or not guilty. But I want to be really clear then that accusations were not always followed by trials, and trials were not always followed by convictions. There were really clear judicial procedures in place. And at the very least, prosecutions required the concurrence of at least some of the neighbors of the witch. It also then required the local courts, which would be the courts that would hear the initial evidence, to decide that the case was worthy enough, and whether it decided to be passed on to the higher court that then could then take the trial further. So the magistrate or the juries of the Court of Assistants or the General Court, depending where in the world you are, they were the ones who alone could try witches. And at any stage, the clergy might interject. And the clergy at any point might interject to support or oppose the accusation. So not all accusations of witchcraft lead to a trial. So in terms of primary sources, we're actually quite spoiled in terms of the sources that survive on witchcraft. One of the most famous sources and one of the earliest sources published in 1486 is Malleus Maleficarum, the translation of the Hammer of the Witches. It was primarily the work of Heinrich Kramer, a Dominican theologian and inquisitor, who was also co-authored, but we're not sure what role he actually played, by Jacob Sprenger. So there's debate about how much of this was written by Kramer and how much of it was written by Sprenger. Sprenger was a member of the Faculty of Theology at the University of Cologne. And this book then was written at a time when the two inquisitors were actually encountering resistance in their efforts to prosecute witches in the area where they were, which is the upper Germany, the upper part of Germany in the Rhineland. And again, we have to think of these primary sources in terms of the timing. So this comes out in 1486, just 2 years before, in 1484, the authors had secured a papal bull from the Pope, basically confirming their authority to proceed against witches in their area. And basically, they include the papal bull as a preface to this work. And basically, the goal of this source, that was again used many times in the 17th century, was basically to be a manual for inquisitors who would try witches. This book then went into 15 printings between 1486 and 1520, and then another 19 printings between 1569 and 1699. And it's no surprise that it gets reprinted, because that's the most intense period of witch hunting in Europe. It's seen by some historians as like the most important treatise on witchcraft, but I actually think there are cases for other ones that I want to make to you. It's useful, but it doesn't give us the full picture of the witch as that emerged into the 17th century. So some other kind of primary sources of note. So this then is Demonology, first published in 1597 and then repeat publication in 1603. This is one of my favorite books on witchcraft because it's by a king, right? It's by King James, King James VI of Scotland, who then goes on to be King James I of England, hence the reprint in 1603 when he takes the English throne. And I just love the fact that this has such a pivotal impact on witch hunting in England, because, you know, up until this point, English witch hunts have been pretty mild and quite temperate because torture is not widely used. And in contrast, torture has been widely used in Scotland. So it's a really interesting case study comparing witch hunting in Scotland versus England, and it's much more intense in Scotland. So the fact that the King of Scotland and England publishes a book on witch hunting and a guide to kind of hunting witches and the judicial procedures has a huge impact on what plays out in England and New England in the 17th century. This is my actual 100% favorite primary source, and I'm really biased just to why this is. So this is Richard Bernard, or Barnard, depending on how you want to say his name, and it's a guide to the grand jurymen, published in London in 1629. So Barnard then was an English clergyman, and he published a bunch of religious works. He was one of the writers in kind of witchcraft historiography who introduced kind of continental European ideas about witchcraft into England in the 17th century. As you can see then, it says on the screen, it's divided into two books. The first part, which you can see, is basically a help guide to members of the grand jury as they try to distinguish between natural diseases and physical conditions such as demonic possession. And then the second part, which is kind of halfway down the title page, is a piece on the nature of witchcraft. So Barnard then was really obsessed, like so many 17th century Protestants and Puritans in particular, with that pact with the devil. And I show you this because as Jenna was saying and Marjorie was saying, I was lucky enough to come and talk to the folks at Little Compton Historical Society last year about Roger Williams' wife. And this is Mary Williams' dad. So this is Roger Williams' father-in-law who publishes this. So again, like I'm working on an article right now on Mary Barnard, and like, what does it mean that her dad publishes this guide to witch hunting in London in 1629? Like, was this on Roger's radar? I mean, I'm asking these questions because I don't know the answer. So I wanted to make at least a tenuous connection to Rhode Island through Mary with her dad. So again, let's have a look at some of the primary sources then. One of the cool things that makes being able to talk about witches so interesting is the woodcuts that have survived. So we have some really great images that we can analyze. So we know then that we were just looking at stuff from the 15th century when we were talking about Malleus. We know then that Johannes Nieder is a Dominican theologian who basically became the head of a Dominican priory in Basel in 1431, and then gets a job at the University of Vienna as a lecturer. And he publishes this theological treatise entitled Formicarius. And so the woodcut that you see here, then we can see that the devil is disguised as a man, right? Like he's wearing clothes and he's kind of got a hat on and a coat and whatnot. And he's trying to tempt this woman into service. And then he's going to reveal his true identity. You can see his taloned feet, his kind of pointy hands, his tails here, and his kind of creepy grin. And he's trying to entice this woman into his service. We also see them from woodcuts that witches and children kind of go hand in hand. So what we can see here then is the devil, like very similar to the image of the devil we saw before. He's a black man with horns or wings and a tail. And these elderly women, again, like note the pointy nose and the chin and the kind of drab dress. And again, we can see children played a twofold role in witchcraft. The devil might offer women who he's trying to recruit children because they would be probably at this point past a childbearing age, but children were also part of the kind of cannibalistic sacrifice that we're going to talk about at the Sabbath in a minute. And you can see also in this woodcut the animal familiars kind of flying around. So we see that not all animal familiars in the 17th century were believed to be black cats. So the witches' Sabbath then, so this is a belief that is pretty prevalent in parts of early modern Europe. It doesn't really take hold in the same way in England and New England, but in parts of early modern Europe and at moments too in the English Atlantic, we see this belief then that witches got together and they had, I guess, a party. And the woodcut that you see here then depicts some of the stuff that goes on at that party. So you can see like the chief organizers of the party here playing some music. We can see that, the devil and his, various subordinates are here. They're in a circle, they're dancing, and we've got kind of women holding hands with them. So there would be music and dancing at the witches' Sabbath. but I mentioned children, right? There's, just as a fair warning, the next few woodcuts are pretty grim, is the honest answer. So we move now into the 17th century then. So what you can see here then is from Guazzo's compendium, first published, well, the edition that we're looking at is from 1610. And again, in the 17th century, it was believed then that witches, you know, as part of the Sabbath would steal babies and would kind of roast them alive in here, and they would consume them. So there was a belief that witches, when they got together in these Sabbaths, would have this kind of cannibalistic ritual with children. So we stick with Guazzo's compendium source from 1610 here and look at what else happens at the witches' Sabbath. So you can see here then that the devil, again, like really standard depiction of the devil with his tail and his horns and his wings, is baptizing people. So a big part of the witch's Sabbath is the devil basically re-baptizing a witch after they've signed their name in his book. And what's really interesting is in this is that we can see both male and female witches being initiated in. And this parody of the Christian sacrament basically signified the witches' commitment to the worship of the devil as their god. And this was really what upset the clergy in the 17th century. In addition to the devil re-baptizing them, another part of the ceremony was basically mocking anything that was tied to Christian faith. Here we can see that once you've been baptized, you literally stand and crush the cross. And again, this image is from the 1610 edition of Guazzo. And my personal favorite is this, right? So the witch then here, this lady here who's just signed her name in the book and has been rebaptized to worship the devil, kisses the devil's bum. And this was, again, a sign, certainly in the eyes of the clergy, of the complete debasement of witches. And again, what's interesting is that we see witches, both male and female, partook in this ritual. So this is a really cool image. Again, we're staying in the 17th century. The image that you see is from Pierre de Lance. De Lance was a French magistrate who was commissioned by Henry IV to investigate witches in the region in around 1606. And his witch hunting resulted in the execution of like quite a lot of people. Like the numbers are disputed, but they're really quite high. And in 1612, then he publishes this description of the inconstancy of bad angels and demons. And from this primary source, we not only get this image that you see on the screen, but we also get one of the most comprehensive descriptions of the witches' Sabbath. And de Lance is basically obsessed with the sexual elements of the Sabbath that I'm about to talk to you about. So you can see a couple of different things going on in this image, right? Like you can see the devil here and the kind of the leaders of the Sabbath. You can see the kind of naked dancing going on here. In the top left, you can see the music and whatnot. You can see that this is probably not going to end well for someone down here. You can see the feasting going on. This bit I'm going to talk to you about in a minute, like what's going on, why are they riding that goat? You know, we can see like 3 people hanging out here together. So this image kind of gives you a taster for what de Lance thought happened when witches signed their name in the devil's book and got together at the Sabbath. So I've put a really long quote on the screen, and I ummed and ahed about whether to include this, but I really think it's important. So I'll read it to you. So this is from the text that I was just sharing with you from de Lance, and this is his description of sex and dancing at the Sabbath. So he says the Sabbath was almost always around midnight, most often on a Wednesday or Friday night, and the devil looked for the stormiest night he could find. 2 notable demons would preside at these Sabbaths, we saw them, and they loved the Grand Master. And after everyone had kissed his backside, there were around 60 who would dance without their cloaks, back to back, each with a large cat attached to the tail of their shirt. Then they would dance completely naked, and even more seriously and hideously, the devil engenders them. an infinity of young virgins, an infinity of witches openly perform their demonic coupling. These are not all games and dances. They are acts of incest, of Satan's copulation with male and female witches. This most odious and accursed coupling comes after the dancing and feast. A coupling so abominable that it's a horror to tell of the particulars. And then he does. He says, you know, the devil in the form of a billy goat has had his limbs in the back and had sexual relations with the women by agitating and pushing against their fronts. His custom is to have sexual relations with beautiful women from the front and the ugly ones from behind. And anyone should not doubt that he takes more pleasure in receiving sexual relations from the back than from the front. He takes more pleasure in sodomy, since he only seeks to offend God and to dishonor the human race. So again, like, educated elite were really fixated on the relationship with the devil and what happened after a witch signed a pact with the devil. So let's talk a little bit more then about the devil's mark that a witch would get when she signed the devil's book. So Nicholas Remy was the author of a treatise, Demonology, published in the late 16th century. He had a really distinguished judicial career in the French-speaking area of Lorraine. And essentially, he ran a really intense campaign against witches in that region. And it's estimated that he sent around 800 witches to their death between 1576 and 1592. And here's what Remy has to say on the devil's mark. So again, I'll share the quotation with you. The devil brands and seals those whom he has newly claimed as his own, marking them especially on that part of the body which was anointed by the priest on their day of baptism. The place is entirely bloodless and insensitive, so that even if a needle be deeply thrust in, no pain is felt and not a drop of blood is shed. This fact is held to be so certain a proof of capital guilt that it is often made the base of examination and torture. So one of the big questions in the early modern Atlantic world was could a witch feel pain? And Remy was pretty sure, certainly in this area, that a witch could not feel pain. And it led to these really quite horrific probings, I guess. So we now turn, I'm now aware it's 7:47 on my watch. So I want to kind of move into the last 5 minutes or so of my talk where I kind of focus specifically on Salem. So you see here then that I put a map of Salem village, so modern day Danvers, up on the screen. And I show this because one of the approaches to understanding Salem is to look at neighborhood disputes and like who'd fallen out with who and who lived where. And so I feel like the map of Salem is actually a really important source for historians. So let's think about statistics then. So we turn our eyes now firmly to New England. Between 1630, so when Massachusetts Bay kind of gets kicked off, between 1692, so between those two dates, 103 witchcraft cases were brought to court in New England. 40 people were accused prior to Salem, and 12 people were executed before 1692. Okay, so that's kind of standard what happens in New England in the 17th century. Let's look at the bottom of the screen then in Salem. So in Salem in 1692, 185 people were accused. And the gendered split then, 141 were women and 44 were men. Of that number, 52 women and 7 men were tried. So think about that drop, right? So from 185 people being accused, that drops, right? Like 52 women and 7 men were tried. So not everybody who was accused was tried. And then of that number, 26 women and 5 men were then convicted. So even the people who were accused, tried, did not automatically get convicted. And then of that number, 14 women and 5 men were executed. So even the people who were accused, tried, and convicted did not necessarily get put to death. And the last group were put to death on the 22nd of September, 1692. So even in these large-scale hunts like Salem is, an accusation did not necessarily lead to an execution. And I think we really need to be cautious with those figures. And one of my kind of favorite books that sets Salem in its context is this book by historian Richard Gobler. His book is called Escaping Salem, The Other Witch Hunt of 1692. And really, this is a really good example of it. If you're looking for a typical New England witch hunt, this book is your go-to. And essentially, excuse me, the book is about the witch hunt that took place in Stamford, Connecticut in the same year as Salem in 1692. So the start of the trials then. So the trials start then when Betty Paris and Abigail Williams start to have strange behavior. They're aged 9 and 11, and they start to feel pinching, they have fits, they start babbling. And essentially then we know that this is a Protestant country, right? Like this, these are Puritans. There's no belief here in what a Catholic would do with an exorcism. So when someone is possessed in Catholic countries around Europe, they would have an exorcism. In Protestant countries such as, you know, England eventually and New England, there's none of that. And they actually bring in the physician to come and have a look at them. And in a very typical Protestant way, they have a day of fasting and prayer trying to fix this. When it doesn't work, we see then that Sarah Good has a warrant sent out for her arrest on the 29th of February. She then gets committed to jail along with Sarah Osborne, and also Tituba gets accused around the same time. Both Good and Osborne basically plead their innocence, but Tituba then does something different, right? And so I want to think about a little bit before we close tonight in like 4 or 5 minutes about the role Tituba plays. And I want to zoom in before we get to Tituba about the role the physician plays. So the physician that they bring in when the girls were initially showing signs of being possessed is William Griggs. Let me say his name right. And he says then that, yeah, there's an evil hand at work. Samuel Parris then, who is the minister in Salem Village, modern day Danvers, basically says, you know, we're going to have a series of prayers, we're going to have a fast day. But unbeknown to him, his neighbor, Mary Sibley, appeals to the 2 indigenous peoples who were living in the Parris household, Tituba and her husband, John. And Sibley asks Tituba to basically make a witch cake. So this is a really good example of the difference between like what the educated elite believe, and then this kind of folk magic and counter magic that was really frowned upon. So anyway, Sibley asked Tituba to make a witch cake, which is a urine cake. And it's a concoction of rye meal, the possessed girl's urine, and then it's typically baked in ashes and fed to the dog. And it's believed then that if the dog is the animal familiar, it would be bewitched and it would reveal the witch. But I want to be really clear to you that it is not Tituba's idea to do this. There's no evidence whatsoever that she did this. This idea comes from a white woman, Mary Sibley. So for me then, I think Tituba is the most important person in Salem in 1692. The image that you see on the screen is not Tituba. This is an 18th century image of an Arawak indigenous woman. And I want to kind of make the point to you then that Tituba is indigenous, right? So we know then that some of the traditional historiography has suggested that Tituba is not necessarily indigenous, but more recent historiography makes it really clear that she is. So primary sources then. So one of the great things about the Salem trials is that we have access to the written record. So this is Tituba's trial transcript, really amazing like 17th century date writing here. And I'm not going to test your paleography today. I'm going to tell you what this says. But I just want to share this with you. So I feel like the confession that Tituba makes when she's accused of witchcraft blends elements of English, African, and also indigenous notions of the occult. And I think she has this key role in shaping the events that played out in Salem in 1692. And she becomes a model for others who are desperate to save their lives. She's described really clearly in the records as an Indian woman servant to Mr. Samuel Parris of Salem Village. There are enslaved Africans who get caught up and accused of witchcraft, and they are clearly categorized in the records as Negro. I'm quoting to you. So Tituba is really important. She convinces the authority that the devil had invaded their society. She confirmed their fears of a conspiracy of Satan's followers. And essentially, she is the one who says in her trial testimony that there are other people outside of Salem. She is also in her trial testimony the one who suggests then that men are involved and also members of the elite were part of the conspiracy. And I think even more important, the third and final point you see on the screen, Tituba then is the one who supplies the evidence of a satanic presence that was legally necessary to launch a witch hunt. And had she remained silent or said something different, it's feasible that the trials might not have occurred or certainly not have played out as they did. So Tituba then initially says that she's innocent. She said, even though the devil had come to her and demanded that she sign his book, she says, I'm not doing it. She initially implicates two other women in Salem who'd already been arrested. And then she also names two Boston women that she doesn't know, and one tall man who is also a Boston. Under closer examination, she told reluctantly of pinching the girls and threatening them. She reported meeting a whole bunch of wonderful and weird animal familiars, a hog, a black dog, a red rat, all of these. And she describes in rich detail Sarah Good's yellow bird. She describes a wolf and also a cat. In the middle of the screen, then, she describes Osborne's familiar. She says it's a thing with a head like a woman, and it had two legs and wings. And it's also a thing all over hairy, all the face hairy and the long nose. I don't know how to tell how the face looks. With two legs, it goes upright, and it's about 2 or 3 feet high. And again, recent historiography has shown how Tituba's trial testimony blends elements of indigenous culture, African culture, because Tituba had been bought by Samuel Parris when he was trying to make his money as a sugar planter in Barbados. So Tituba had come from South America as a slave to Barbados, and then from Barbados to Salem. And it blends elements of all of these confessions. And on the second day, then, she talks about how there's a pair of women who basically were really strong, and they made all 3 of them go together and they ride on a pole or a stick. And on the second day, then, Tituba confesses to signing her mark in blood in the devil's book. So she confesses to being a witch. But what's so important is that she saw 9 marks in the book, 9 other people. So what that means is that as soon as she says that, the people in Salem are like, who are these 9 witches? And it is the confession that basically means that it doesn't just stay confined to Salem village, it starts looking all around New England. So I feel like that's what's really important, and it turns eyes to places like Boston. So just to wrap up then, so some of these places, hopefully in a post-COVID world, you'll be able to go and visit. Here's me with some of my students when I taught this class last time. It looks like we're stood in a hole. We're not. We're stood in the foundations of the house where Samuel Parris lived, and it's where Tituba would have initially been accused. And I show you this because it really, the sign that is there, and it's basically in someone's back garden. You kind of go behind there and you have to know it's there. Anyway, the sign that is there, it's the 1681 Salem Village Parsonage. And, you know, it's really not that important at the top, but the bit at the bottom is what is problematic. It says, it was in this house in 1692 that Tituba, Reverend Parris's slave, told the girls of the household stories of witchcraft, which nurtured the village witchcraft hysteria and resulted in the deaths of 23 people. That's just wrong. Like, I don't know how else to say this to you this evening, but that information is wrong. There's no evidence whatsoever that Tituba is the one who nurtured the girls with stories of witchcraft. We would have heard in the records if she was known in the village as a cunning person. And the first time that she gets implicated is when a white woman, Mary Sibley, asks her to bake the urine cake. And if you're interested, there's some really great books that I recommend. This is by Elaine Breslau. This is one of the books I set for my student that looks at witchcraft in the Atlantic world context. And the stuff I was just talking to you about Tituba comes from the work that Breslau has also done specifically on Tituba. If you're interested in learning more in Salem, this is Mary Beth Norton's In the Devil's Snare that basically sets sets the witchcraft trials of 1692 in the broader frame of like the impact of wars with indigenous peoples in the build up to 1692. So she really kind of pictures this idea of almost post-traumatic stress syndrome being a trigger after so much war. The middle book that I suggest to you is Boyer and Nissenbaum's Salem Possessed, that looks at basically disputes between neighbors and families, and basically does a whole piece of work by looking at maps and charts and data. And then Carol Carlson's The Devil in the Shape of the Woman really picks up the gender element if you're interested. And my last slide then is, if you're interested in more of the European stuff that I was talking about, I really recommend the works by Brian Levac. His Witch Hunt in Early Modern Europe and the corresponding primary source book are really, really wonderful additions. All right, well, it's bang on 8 o'clock, so I talked for, I think, a little bit longer than I anticipated, but I hope that's okay. I'm going to stop then my screen share, and I'm really happy now to take some questions.
Okay, so I have 2 questions so far, and anyone else who has any questions, please feel free to enter them into the chat and send them to me. So the first one is, one of the first woodcuts that you showed, there was a man at left and a witch on the right with 2 familiars. That was a 17th century woodcut. You showed so many as time went on.
You know, I'm trying to remember. I'm sorry. I'm just going back. What did you say, Jenna? He's got.
There's a man on the left, and on the right there's a witch and 2 familiars. It's one of the first woodcuts that you showed.
All right. Oh, is it the one with the horse? Is it this one? Hold on. Let me just go back to screen sharing. And what was the question? Oh, is it a 17th century woodcut? If it's this one, this is.
No, it's one a little bit. It was a couple slides further down from that.
Okay, hold on. Let me go through. This one? No. Okay, this one?
That's the one. No. Yes. No, that was the one.
Oh, yeah. So this is a really interesting one. This is one that gets used. So one of the things I should say actually about the woodcuts is that they get used time and time again. So it will originally be published, and then you'll see it pop up in so many other versions of like witchcraft treaties. So stuff will be published that will be, say, about like witches in Lancashire, and then all of a sudden it will appear like in the 18th century. So this then comes from Mather's. We know that this comes from Mather's Wonders of the Invisible World, published in the 1680s, but then it gets used again in the 18th century when stuff gets published about witches that had been put on trial in Lancashire. So the answer is yes, and also no. It originally is, and then it gets used again later. Does that make sense?
Yes. Barnard's source mentioned good witches and bad witches. What was the difference, and were good witches also hunted and punished?
Yeah, that's such a good question. So this is one of the debates that rocks early modern Europe. And so remember me saying with Barnard that he brings ideas from mainland Europe into English discourse on witch hunting, and that's one of the ones that really takes prevalence. It's based on one of the debates that we see like in France and also Germany, and a bunch of theologians publish on this. And it depends who you ask, right? Like, so some people are like, all witches are really terrible, because think about it, what it means when you say someone's a witch, right? You make that accusation and you're saying someone signed their name in the devil's book, and that has all those connotations that I've said. What they also suggest then is some witches aren't necessarily as bad, and we see that this switches between the medieval period and the early modern period, where the accusation in the medieval period tends to be made towards men who are kind of like more educated, who are doing more sorcery rather than witchcraft. So there is a belief that some, like, so it's not as it's the key point is that whether they've been possessed or whether they've been a witch, and there is that distinguishment. But I feel like the main point that most of the theologians make is that if you dabble in witchcraft, like that's terrible, right? Like if you're doing counter magic like Mary Sibley with the urine cake, that's bad. But if you sign your name in the devil's book, that's beyond repair.
What were some of the reasons that those, what were some of the reasons that those convicted of witchery were either spared or executed? So what made that distinction?
Yeah, so that's such a good point. You know, you see sometimes testimony from the clergy often makes a really big difference. Like if you have been accused and you've been, you know, convicted, but then at the last minute, a clergy member steps up and vouches for you. Another thing is like lack of evidence. So one of the big things that makes Salem so different is that it allows spectral evidence. So spectral evidence is when, you know, you say, I saw the vision of goody so and so at the bottom of my bed, but she was in the shape of a hog or a dog or a wolf, but I just knew it was her. So I'm almost in a dream state, and I kind of imagine that I've seen someone in my bedroom who's about to do me harm, but it doesn't look like them. And so there's a real kind of doubt as the 17th century progresses as to whether that's reliable evidence. So some of the cases collapse because of that. And then another really good example is the Pendle trials in England, where they take testimony from children, and that eventually, not that trials, but later trials then collapse on the basis it's just children giving evidence. And obviously that doesn't play out in Salem, right, because it starts with, you know, a girl who's 9 and 11 and spectral evidence takes place. But again, normally that would be questioned, and you would need evidence from multiple neighbors. It couldn't just be that you and your neighbor Peter or whatever had a bit of a dispute. You would have to have other like neighbors testify. And so yeah, there's some of the reasons why it collapsed. And you could save yourself by like confessing, like we see with Tituba, right? Like she confesses and she lives to tell the tale. She eventually, you know, gets sold on to some unknown family, and we're really not sure what happens to her. So confession could be a way to take the heat off you and to kind of tell people to start looking for other people.
Did the witch hunt craze ever extend to the West Indies via trade routes and connections, or was that mostly contained to New England?
That's such a good question, and I can't say that I know. I should know more because, you know, my new work is on the West Indies and is interested in animals, but it's not something that I've studied extensively, and I'm sure my colleagues would know more about this. So I honestly don't know the answer to that question, and I would love to know. I would make a guess that it goes both ways, right? Tituba is a really good example, right? She's South American Arawak who is enslaved and taken to Barbados, who while she's in Barbados, she meets enslaved Africans, and we see a melting of all of these culture, right? Like with white English culture too. So I think there's a mix, you know, based on slave trade routes and planter routes in the sugar colonies. But yeah, I can't tell you some of the specifics. I mean, I know that there's overlap, but I can't speak to any specifics.
Were there witch trials that took place in Boston proper?
Yeah, so there are. Let me just go back to my screen share. So where are we? We see then, let me go back here to our friend Tituba. Perhaps the most famous thing that she says is, it's not on there, no, it's on here, is that basically this bit, that line that she says at the bottom of the thing is groundbreaking. She says really clearly, she specifically names the place of Boston as to where the lead male witch is, and you know, she makes it really clear that this is a high status individual who lives in Boston. And so it then turns the attention. So this is one of the cases that historians have made, is that we shouldn't talk about the Salem trials, is that we should talk about, you know, 1692 should be the Essex County trials or the Massachusetts trials or the New England trials, because she is the one who turns the attention away from Salem into Boston and spurs that hunt that is not just in the village and the town of Salem, but also down into Boston. So that's perhaps the best example I can give you, specifically linked to Boston.
What are your thoughts on the intersection between sexual identity and witchcraft?
Yeah, I know. I have many thoughts. I could probably talk for a long time on that. I think it's I think it's a thing that historians are really careful to be aware of when they read those primary sources. So when I included, you know, that really kind of graphic description of like sex and dancing at the Sabbath, you know, not everybody bought into that. And I think there's all of the sources that we see from the 17th century have this heavily gendered nature, and they make it really clear that the educated elite believe that, you know, women were the weaker sex, and one of the reasons why the devil would be able to entice them is that, you know, he could offer them stuff that they were, you know, not sexually fulfilled. So there's, I think historians are really clued up to the fact that this is like rich white men, educated men, right, like writing this, and there's a real natural prejudice there. But yeah, that sexual nature and the gender element too is yeah, I can make some really good suggestions in the Breslau book, The Witches of the Atlantic World. There are like 3 or 4 essays on gender and witchcraft that really do buy into that.
Were clairvoyants distinguished from witches?
Yeah, that's such a good point. Yeah. So, well, the question is has the person signed the name in the devil's book, right? Or are they just doing some kind of folk magic? And one of the things we know really quite clearly is that there is folk magic that carries on, right? Like even in places such as New England, right? Like we know that like Mary Sibley's urine cake is a good example. And so the educated elite at times just kind of turned a blind eye to that, as long as they know it's just an individual doing that. They don't advocate and say it's fine, but they can turn a blind eye. The question then becomes is, you know, has that person signed their name in the devil's book? Is it a conspiracy of witches who are looking to fundamentally undermine our established religion? And so it was one of the things that witches were believed to be able to do. So it could be used as one piece of evidence, right? Like when someone is formally accused of being a witch, it's one of the like check boxes, like, well, she made that fortune and she knew that this big storm was coming, but it's not the be all and end all, you know?
Right. It makes me think of Joan of Arc. Like at first they looked at her as someone who was having visions from God, and then, you know,
yeah,
once she got handed over, it was a left turn.
And another really good example that kind of buys into that is the age thing too. You know, we tend to think of witches as being elderly, right? Like they're always like a typical witch is an old woman, but that's probably because it took many years for these accusations to build up, right? To have enough evidence over time to then formally put her on trial and convict her. So some of these initial accusations of like fortune telling or whatever it might be might have come when she was in her 20s, but it builds up over time to that formal accusation.
You mentioned that during rituals, the devil always has his 2 demons by his side. Has there ever been any documentation? Is it usually like the same couple demon? Do they have names, or is it just kind of demons?
Like there's so he has like his incubi and succubi. There's a gendered element to his demons. In the Sabbath, he has basically yeah, like a head demon. Sometimes if I took this bit out the quotation because it was really long, they focus on specific Sabbaths that they have information on, and so obviously the people attending the Sabbath is different depending on the time and the place. But there's a whole piece of research that you know, Brian Levack's talked about the gendered nature of subordinate demons to the devil. So I encourage people interested in that to check out Levack's work.
Were more educated people less likely to make witchcraft accusations? Is there an education level distinction in the accusers?
Yeah, that's a really big question, and there have been 4 essays in the past 3 years that have been published that talk about this. Like, where do the accusations come from? The answer is most of the initial accusations tend to come from neighbors, like when they've had like neighborly disputes. But the educated elite are the gatekeepers, right? They're the ones who make the decision as to whether that accusation has any weight. So again, I'm making, one of the things I don't want to do is talk about the European witch hunt or the New England witch hunt, because it varies. But generally speaking, it tends to come from neighbors, but the clergy and the educated elite, the judiciary, they're the ones who make the decision. And you know, let me just actually screen share one more time, because I wanted to show you some of the things that we have. So Brian Levac, I've mentioned him a few times. He has it, like, you can literally Google Brian Levac witch hunt and it will take you to this site. And you can see that he's basically put this really cool interactive map where you can kind of click on a place. He does Europe, but you can click on a place and it tells you specifically about that. And this is to kind of stop us making generalizations. And he's also done this really cool, like, interactive timeline that kind of shows the rise and fall of witch hunting in early modern Europe, where, like, there's a peak in Spain here, there's a down in Germany here, and you can kind of like click on this. And so I encourage people to look for that. And I guess actually while I'm on sources, I forgot to show this. And so this is the, again, if you type in like Salem primary sources, this is the one that was put together, I don't know, like a few years ago now by the University of Virginia. And it's an amazing resource for people interested in Salem. It's got all of the court records that you'll need. It's got like historical maps, it's got diaries, it's got sermons, it's got personal letters, it's got links to archival collection, it's got like links to books that are published on Salem. So there's an amazing amount of resources out there that I think make this so much more accessible than it was, maybe 10, 20 years ago. I know.
Okay, I have other questions, but I'm only going to ask you one more because we are running later than we expected. So
if people do have questions, like, tell them to kind of look me up, and I'm happy for them to email me.
Okay, great. So I've heard kind of the arguments that it's ergot poisoning. I've heard it was social control. So where is the current scholarship in what people think was the root cause?
Yeah, I just literally got my copy of Witches of the Atlantic World to hand, because it has a whole chapter on the theory of ergot, right? So, traditional history, so it's got a chapter on medical and psychological interpretations, and there are 3 essays on there that deal with that. So I would say that, like, historians really do take the ergot theory with a salt. Like, when I teach my class, there's always going to be one student who like pitches that to me, and I direct them to this chapter in Breslau. And that's a big question, like why did this happen? I think I'm really persuaded by the work that Elaine Breslau has done, that has basically centered the role of Tituba, an enslaved Arawak indigenous woman who shapes the course of the trial, right? Like, as I was trying to say to you, if she hadn't have said, I saw like 9 signatures in his book, they're all in Boston, like, would it have played out as it did? The other kind of theories are all, Mary Beth Norton, talks about post-traumatic stress syndrome having an impact on the people who make the accusations. Boyer and Nissenbaum, they're talking about like interpersonal disputes and rivalry. So there are many different theories. Like, there's another theory that talks about the role of Samuel Parris, who is the pastor in Danvers, who, he's just a massive failure, right? Like, he's one of the only people I know who goes to Barbados in the 17th century and tries to make money planting sugar and fails, and it's his last chance to make something of himself, and he, it doesn't work for him as the minister. He gets caught in these rivalries. So, I can't say that there's one particular theory. I mean, I'm not really into the ergot theory. I think Richard Goddard, the historian, makes this amazing point where he says, you have to just understand that, like, people believed in magic and people believed in witchcraft. So you don't need to look for that, like, 2021 understanding of what was the scientific belief. Like, if you truly believe in this, then you're going to buy into that. So you have to understand why witchcraft made sense to people in the 17th century to try to get inside their heads. So that's where I'm at. But there's always new scholarship coming out. So
thank you so much for being here tonight, Charlotte. Thank you to everyone who attended. And as she said, if you have more questions, because we had many more than I was able to end up answering, feel free to look her up at Roger Williams.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a real pleasure to chat with you. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you have questions. Please do feel free to reach out to email me.
Thank you so much, everybody. Have a good night.